Great. Welcome back. This is back to the House Transportation Committee. We're going to continue our afternoon testimony, focusing on the proposed FY24 budget and funding options. So we have Bradley Kuchenberger with us. With us for the afternoon. And so I'm going to turn it over to you. We have 3 presentations this afternoon. So just so that for the committee, for the benefit of the committee, we have Bradley speaking about transportation funding outlook and options. And then we have Costa Pappas from the agency talking about a prior legislative report on transportation revenue and options. And then we have Chris Roop from our joint fiscal office about the history and breakdown of motor vehicle purchase and use tax. So as we are fielding questions, sometimes your questions might relate to something later, but we'll do our best here. So so feel free Bradley, if it's the question should be directed someplace else. So anyway, so why don't you start us off?
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Bradley Kuchenberger. I'm Chief Financial Officer for the Agency of Transportation. I'm here to talk about the transportation funding outlook and options. This is kind of a continuation of a discussion we began last week. And I was going to do an overview kind of in general terms of a bit of a review of what we talked about and some of the funding options that both the administration proposes, and then also just more of an academic, here's kind of what the options I think are. So I know some of you have handouts, and this is also posted on the committee website, I believe, or on the screen. So we discussed last week a federal kind of our approach, the administration's approach to funding what we consider the federal fund match gap between fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 26. So I wanted to revisit this table to highlight a couple of points. One is I did make an update to the FY27 column. My colleague Chris Roop pointed out that we hadn't accounted for all of the general fund bridge program. That is more of how the state fiscal year and federal fiscal years lined up. So I wanted to make sure that was trued up and that we had the full $225 million of the general fund bridge program for Vermont included in our table. So that's in the upper right-hand corner, the $35 million line is different than the chart I gave you last week. But the other thing I wanted to point out is that if we look at fiscal year 24, which had very little investment in what we're calling the discretionary or competitive grant programs of the IIJA, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. More so because of lack of understanding of the guidance due to the novelty of the program. So if we look at 24 and then we also look at 27, where we can't say with any certainty that these competitive or discretionary grant programs are going to continue in existence, we get to a bottom line state match surplus or deficit number of approximately $11 million. So that's something I think we can use as a reference point, which would, increase over time, but only by a small margin. So I'm calling about $11 to $12 million being a kind of normal year's budget gap for just matching federally aid projects. Now, there's other pressures in the agency, and there's also the understanding of how our revenue grows year over year. So I put in a slide that shows, I'm going to start on the right-hand side, what our other kind of base budget pressures are in a general sense, in an approximation. So every year we know our salaries and benefits go up about $5 million. And we know that the cost of our statewide allocations goes up about $500,000 that's for our space costs or our IT system costs and things like that. And then we also have a built-in formula increase for things like the town highway programs, the central garage equipment fund, and we support a portion of the Vermont, or the BGS info centers on our highways. But altogether, we know that there's kind of an annual total base budget increase of about $7 million a year without us doing anything or changing anything, all projects aside. On the left-hand side of the column, I put in the consensus revenue amounts that total the transportation fund and TIB revenues. So basically all of our state funds revenues for 24 through 27. And you'll see each year, based on the consensus revenue report, it's between a $4 and $5 million growth in estimated revenue. So if we look at the difference between our annual estimated budget pressures and our revenue estimated growth, it's between like $2 to $3 or $4 million a year, depending on the year and how it all comes out in the wash. So in total, if we take kind of our understanding from the first slide of about $11 or $12 million, and from the second slide of our just normal budgetary pressures, I'm going to say that the transportation fund is on trend to be about $15 million short on base funding to match the new level of federal apportionment and our current budget pressures in a normal year. And then in fiscal years 25 and 26, we're anticipating a requirement of additional investment of approximately $68 million for our discretionary grant opportunities, some of which we discussed last week. So that's kind of an ongoing need and a short-term need. So what are the options as I see it? So option number one is described in the FY24 governor's recommended proposal. So that's a transfer of surplus general funds of $79 million to the T fund for years 2024 through 2026. That's 10 million or almost 11 million in 24 and 68 million in 25 and 26. That is a one-time kind of funding influx for the T fund under the governor's recommended proposal. I should say before we continue that I'm only advocating for option number one, but all of the others to follow are
Good.
yeah, understood. Appreciate it. So option number two is the question of what other uses besides agency of transportation projects and programs utilize transportation fund revenues. So there's two. One is an appropriation to public safety that the transportation fund makes each year of about $20.25 million. And there's statutes surrounding what those funds are to be used for, and it was part of a discussion we had last session. There's also a portion of motor vehicle purchase and use tax, which accounts for approximately $50 million a year that goes to the education fund. So an option for funding ongoing agency needs is some combination of allowing the money that comes into the transportation fund to be used exclusively for agency programs and initiatives. And I'm not going to go through the ways in which you could slice it all up, but you could be as creative as you wanted to get to the number you needed. But those are the two non-AOT items in our budget or revenue line items. The third available funding option is transportation infrastructure bonding. So we charge an assessment on fuel and diesel tax that goes into the Transportation Infrastructure Bond Fund. And that is a revenue stream that is meant to cover our ability to bond for transportation specific projects. In the last session, we paid off our remaining bonds. And as a result, we don't have any current bonding obligations against it. So all we do is we use those dollars for pay-go investments in our budget. I will say that it's nice to look on the balance sheet and not have a debt service payable of $2.5 million a year. And that interest rates at this point in time are rather high for bonding. However, it is an option for influx of cash. Now may not be the best time to do it, however. Option number 4 is to cut programs or delay projects. This is the basic work that your committee does to align with the initiatives that you want to advance. Some things need to cut and other things need to go up based on whatever you'd like to do. So that's option number 4, certainly. And the last option I will mention is to propose a revenue package to raise fees or fuel taxes or some alternative revenue source. And it would be remiss of me not to note that the administration's stance this year is not to approve any tax or fee increase for transportation funding unless or until the JTOC appropriation is repealed and the transportation fund keeps 100% of motor vehicle purchase and use tax. So as I see it, those are the available options to all of us working in this policy arena and how to come up with additional funding to meet ongoing pressures. And I'm through my presentation. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
That'd be great. I want to open up questions to the committee, and also we have Representative Demeraux here from the House Ways and Means Committee, and you should, feel free to ask questions too, if you're a member of our committee. So I think Representative McCoy.
So I just, on this chart that you have, are we, is this deficit due to the IIJA money? All of this deficit?
Yes.
Is IIJA monies coming in?
Right.
In order to utilize these?
In order to
This is our match.
maximize our ability to match federal aid projects. That's kind of what's driving that deficit is additional. I'm not going to call it need, it's more of a desire.
Correct.
Yeah.
Like this is the bucket of money the federal government gave to us in IIJA, and if we choose to use it, this is our share.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Are there other questions? Representative Shaw.
Brad, I'm looking at this one.
Yeah.
State match surplus deficit, I understand the 10,000,009 this year. And then understand that 33 million is calculations that we've made for potential IIJA and et cetera. How do we get to 68 million in the summation?
So in the summation page, so I kind of broke it out into 2 different items. One's an ongoing need that I'm seeing of approximately $15-ish million moving forward per year that we'd need. But there's also a short-term need due to the discretionary grants and competitive grant programs that we're gearing up to apply for and utilize in fiscal years 25 and 26. So they're both budget pressures, but they're different flavors of budget pressure. One is something that we'll have to come up with in perpetuity if this level of federal investment will continue. So that's like about $15 million, which is the difference in the match you'll see in fiscal 24 or 27 at the bottom line, plus our known cost driving increases year over year. And then the $68 million is the sum of my pointer on the screen. It's the sum of these two here. So really the driver is these big competitive grant programs that we're trying to match in the next couple of years.
It's not IIJA driver competitive.
Yeah, they were made available through the IIJA, but there's nothing that we can hang our hat on that says that will be a continued investment at that level. We can pretty reliably expect the core general, the formula fund programs to continue at that higher level, I think with some accuracy, but we're not going to bank on those large competitive programs that brought, billions of dollars yearly to the country.
Okay, all right. Other questions right now? Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Bradley. Representative Bartholomew.
It certainly makes sense to use money collected for transportation uses rather than education. And if you said, I apologize, but if we were to take the 50 million that goes to education, how would the governor propose we make that up?
I cannot speak to that. I could get back to you, however.
He would say it's on his proposal. His proposal is number one.
What?
Right?
Yeah, that's
a response.
That's currently not the proposal on the table, but that discussion, I'd have to.
We don't get down
I'd have
to
to ask
5 where
about
it
that.
says he would be really unhappy. But then it says in there, repealed and keep the transportation fund, keep 100%. I'm assuming that that's what it means to
So-
take the 50 million.
Yeah, so the position, and I've been told very clearly that the position is of the governor that there should not be increases to our current fees and fuel taxes without first going to those other options to fund transportation need.
Okay.
And those other two options, I meant the JTOC appropriation and the education fund.
He hasn't shared with you how he would make that up if we were to take that option.
Not at present.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Campbell.
Sorry, I must be obtuse about this, but so the governor's recommending transferring $79 million. And how did we get to 79 million again? Is that including what you're showing for FY 25
Yes.
and 26?
Yeah, so the administration asked the agency to put together this proposal pretty much. And what we came up with was a funding gap for our state match. And that's $79 million is the sum of the 10.9 million in fiscal 24, the 30, and then in the budget, it says 68 million. The 10.9 is spelled out specifically, and then there's another set of language that says 68 million of general fund is reserved for 25 and 26. So I split it out like this just to make the zeros come out at the bottom, but it could be split out as needed in relation to the language of the bill.
So I just want to understand the 79 includes money needed for FY 24 and money being reserved for FY 25 and 26.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
You got it.
What's his name has a question.
Oh, sorry, Representative House.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question, which I think we touched on a previous presentation, was the some of the minimums, the competitive grants, we're sort of just estimating what those grants might be. They could be larger, and if that's the case, we would need to come up with more matching funds. Is that true, or is that the maximum we could get?
We have a pretty good sense, representative, of what there's certain programs that have state minimums, so we know kind of at minimum what we get, and we also know the basket of projects that would be eligible for these particular grants. So we have a pretty good sense of the scope of the competitive grants that we can go after. But I think your statement is plausible in that if there's further guidance and notification that either expands eligibility or makes this a better fit for the agency, there's potential for additional competitive grant needs, and that would increase our state match or allow us to make different project decisions to free up that match, you know. Did that make sense? It's kind of, I'm not sure it was so coherent.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Other questions from the committee? Okay, if not, I think we'll thank you, Bradley.
Thank you.
Are you able to stick around? Well,
Yes,
the rest?
I'm planning on sticking around.
Excellent. Thank you.
Costa and Chris.
Great. So Costa, please join us at the table. Well, welcome. Since this is your first time in our committee, I'd like to go around the table so you know our names as well. So if we could do that, we'll do that first.
Sure.
Okay, so why don't we start at the end of the table?
Patty McCoy, representing the towns of Pulteney, Ira, and that portion of Wells west of Route 30.
Representative.
Afternoon, Matt Walker, represent Swanton and Sheldon from way up in Franklin County.
Scott Campbell, St. Johnsbury.
Butch Pittsburgh and Proctor.
So Sarah Coffey, Vernon, and Guilford are my towns.
Tim Corcoran, Bennington.
Lally, Shelburne. Hi there, Brattleboro. Nice to see you.
CU representative.
And John Bartholomew, Heartland, and Windsor, and West Windsor.
And we've a member joining us online.
And Phil Pouch online from Heinsberg.
Heinsberg, great. Well, welcome to the committee and good afternoon.
Thank you. And for the record, my name is Costa Pappas. I'm the Federal Policy Director at the Agency of Transportation. And I've been asked today to talk about a couple of transportation and revenue studies that were conducted in the past. My presentation is oral just because it's brief and it's full of narrative that doesn't lend itself easier to PowerPoints, but at the request of the committee, I have no issues plugging in and displaying this stuff on a screen.
Right, so we do have the documents either in printed form or on our committee page. So thank you for that. It's nice to, if we do need to see words on the big screen, give me a wave, but otherwise we'll follow along with you.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, great. So the history or the recent history of transportation revenue studies dates back to the 2012 session with Act 153. That was the transportation bill for that year. In a report that was produced by the Agency of Transportation in consultation with the Joint Fiscal Office titled Vermont Transportation Funding Options. So just to lay the context for what was going on at that time, there was a concern expressed by, I believe, both the administration and the legislature over where we were funding-wise with federal transportation matters and federal transportation regulations. So advances in fuel economy were accelerating at the time. I jokingly tell folks that I traded in my 15-mile-to-the-gallon Oldsmobile for a 30-mile-to-the-gallon Nissan, identical size vehicle, same engine. The fuel economy doubled. That was actually a trend back then of improving fuel economy for regular fossil fuel vehicles and the growth of hybrid, not the plug-in ones, but the original hybrid vehicles. So those two factors combined with the recession of 2008, 2009 resulted in gasoline consumption declining pretty drastically. Up to that point, it was pretty consistent on the increase till about the late 2000s, and then it started declining as a result of the recession and just improvements to the fuel economy. At the time, there was also an understanding that eventually electric vehicles would rise in prominence and also have an impact on the fuel tax portion of the transportation fund. So that was kind of the general concern at the time. We're simply collecting less fuel taxes because folks are consuming less fuel due to various issues. So as part of that legislation, a committee on transportation funding was put together that included Representative Lanford, Senator Kitchell representing the Vermont House and Senate. It also included the Secretary of Transportation, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies, and the Jeffords Center for Policy Research. So this group was tasked with generating potential revenue ideas, and that's what that report did. The main task of that committee was to estimate the gap between revenue sources and the cost to maintain, operate, and build the transportation system. So what that report concluded is we had at the time an annual $241.3 million deficit that we would have chronically simply to maintain our infrastructure. So this isn't like the full build out, let's make everything brand new. This was, if we continue simply doing what we're doing, $241.3 million a year would be the deficit between what we collected in federal and state transportation funds and what we needed to expend to maintain the infrastructure. So the report cataloged various types of fees and taxes. It did not make a specific recommendation on which one or which ones to follow. But what happened a little while after that report was concluded was that in July of 2014, there was a change in the way Vermont's gas tax worked. It basically shifted from a flat 20 cents per gallon assessment to the hybrid 13.1 cents per gallon and 4% retail assessment that we have today. And of course, subject to a price and floor. But that was the big item that came out of that report. It was shifting the gas tax from a pure per pennies to the gallon to this hybrid method where adjustments in price would be reflected and more accurately collect revenue for the transportation fund. That was in 2012, and that report was submitted in 2013. The gas tax was changed in 2014. In 2015, or the 2015 session, Act 40 asked us, the agency, in consultation with the Joint Fiscal Office, to again examine revenue sources. There was no committee established for that one, but examine revenue mechanisms other than fuel taxes. So this report got even more specific than the original one. And the reason for that was at the time some sort of acknowledgement that we were shifting from one piece of federal legislation to the other, and that electric vehicles were becoming more prominent, that electric vehicles would account for a significantly higher share of the total vehicle market. So what was happening with federal legislation is that we had MAP 21. I don't remember the full acronym. They give these pieces of legislation lengthy titles, but that was a 2-year surface transportation bill. Not very, it was out of the norm in the sense that typically federal transportation bills go for 5 years. This one was a 2-year bill, and there was this idea that perhaps what would follow MAP 21 would have significantly more funding attached to it than the previous bill. That was the discussion at the time federally. That did not materialize the way the IIJA included significantly more money than the FAST Act. So although that didn't materialize, it was a variable at the time that was under consideration. Will we have enough state funds to cover what was expected to be more federal money? And then with electric vehicles, there were, Tesla came out with a model that was very popular. Other manufacturers pledged to increase the availability of electric vehicles. And that was a pretty strong indication when you hear manufacturers making a pledge to go in a direction that you need to take that seriously from the revenue perspective, with the vehicles not consuming fuel taxes. Again, this report did not include any recommendations, but it looked at a broader set of potential funding sources that range from transportation user fees from existing revenue mechanisms, so increasing those, generating new user fees, and also it examined broader based, non-transportation specific revenue sources like the general fund and changing the way sales tax was allocated. The report is very detailed. It goes on at length explaining what each of those potential revenue sources would include. And that report, again, did not include a recommendation. What followed that report was a request by the House Transportation Committee in 2022 for the agency to update the values of the 2015 report to reflect year 22 figures. So that was not in legislation. That was a committee request. We provided that information. That's on page 2 of the handout with a summary table that shows what the updated figures are if the information was available at the time that it was requested. So plenty, as you can see from this list, in terms of revenue options that were considered in 2015. I would obviously encourage reviewing the report if you'd like more information, or I can explain it because each of these, there's an explanation as to how the mechanism would work and also some of the limitations. The chief one being that we didn't analyze these from an economic perspective, so some of these are sensitive to changes in fees or taxes. For example, if a bicycle registration fee were to be enacted, that may discourage bicycle sales. We don't know. We didn't make assumptions about what would occur in that situation. And that's essentially it, simply tracing the history of those two revenue studies, kind of explaining the reasons why they were developed and what resulted from them. Other than that, Madam Chair, I'm willing to entertain questions, expand on this report, provide you with more reports, whatever the pleasure of the committee is.
Well, I appreciate you coming in. We appreciate you coming in. I know you just did this last year, like around this time in February too. So it's helpful for new members of the committee. I just want to say, if members of the committee do want to find those other reports, I believe I've been able to track them down as well. And if I know that they're not on our committee page, but they are
on the committee page. They're hyperlinked.
And through the hyperlinks, right? So they're not as separate documents, I'm trying to say, but through the hyperlinks in your presentation.
That's right. So both the documents are hyperlinked, and what we did in 22, updating the 2015 report, is appended to the submission that's on the website. So you have access to all the reports and the work that was undertaken.
So this is just, this is kind of informational for the committee. A lot of this, as members know, the revenue, our revenue committee is our Ways and Means committee in the House. So, but this is really just, these are conversations that have percolated up in the committee. And so, and you, it's great to have you here because your expertise is on a lot of the federal programs. So, so if committee members want to, this is your moment to This chart, I have to say, this chart is really clear, you know, to kind of just your extrapolation of what the larger report was. So it's really helpful.
Just have a general question.
Yeah, go ahead.
About potential grants that might be teeing up. Can you give us a little preview what, Costas is our grant guy. Anything on the horizon that our committee should know about?
So that's an interesting question because we definitely have grants that we're considering. I think for some of the modes, like when you look at our rail plan and our aviation plan, there's a clear pathway, you know, of where we're going long term, and I would expect that projects that are important from that plan would likely be applications to the federal government for different funding.
Bennington to Albany?
There's a
Bennington.
there is a track replacement project on the western quarter between Rutland and Bennington. Well, technically to Hoosick, New York.
Yeah.
That is a priority for the agency. Well, because it's a priority in the state rail plan.
Right, making progress. See, yes, 100 times.
The challenge with grant applications is that the rules are not consistent every year. They can change, and the federal agencies get to include a lot of guidance as to what they want to receive. So it doesn't necessarily hold that something that's the focus of a federal agency this year will be the focus next year. And I'll give you an example for rail because you brought it up. The federal government through what's called the CRISI, the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure Program, has had different focus areas. One time it's on positive train control. Another round may be on freight projects. It's not consistent from year to year. And the same holds true for other programs like the Federal Transit Administration. Big priority right now on low or no emissions vehicles. So one of the reasons why we've been applying for a lot of electric buses is that it's not only a priority of the states, it's also where the federal government is going with transit vehicles.
So those are coming up in the near term?
Which ones?
Any grant?
Yeah, the grants are available this year, and they will be available if the appropriators, that's one of the key things I want to mention here, because we often forget that in the federal transportation world, the apportionments or the grant programs that are developed by the authorizing committee need to be concurred with by the appropriations committee. And so roughly 20% of the federal transportation program for highways involves general funds. The Highway Trust Fund no longer fully funds the outlays for that program. So there's about 20% of general funds that need to be transferred into that every year for funding that comes to the states. And the grant programs, a lot of them are purely general funded. So the supplemental bridge program, $225 million that Vermont will receive over 5 years, the 21 or so million for electric vehicles, and a large portion of the discretionary grant programs are general funds. They're not part of the Highway Trust Fund. So my point about appropriations is very important, because if the dollar amounts change for these grant programs, it could be that some of the eligibilities will change.
Are you going to be looking for flexibility as you have in the past when we're not in session to apply for grants? Of course, we haven't gotten our T-bill, but are you going to look for some discretion when we're not here to apply for grants? Or?
Well, we don't. I mean, we apply for grants when the notice of funding opportunity comes along. That isn't set on a set timetable.
Oh, okay. It
can be January next year or June the next year, but that's how we approach the grants. We don't want to miss an opportunity if we have a project that's ready that's going to be competitive for grants. And we think we are going to be competitive. Hence, the budget assumptions that you saw from Bradley earlier moving forward. You saw some of that for rail, some of it for aviation, some for transit. But we are going to be very deliberate in what we apply for to make sure that priorities are funded.
Representative Burke has a question.
Yeah, this is really great analysis, Pastor. And in looking at it, I look and I go, okay, there was this study and then there was another study, and we really to solve the structural problem. And now the proposal is to use money from the general fund to, and I guess it's because the IIJA, that sort of ups the ante, but still, we haven't really solved the structural problem. And what's the answer to that? And there's lots of suggestions of what that would be, but it just seems like, you know, and I think certainly at this point, I mean, I know there's been discussion about vehicle miles tax, you know, but vehicle miles traveled and all of that, and I think that's fine. And having electric vehicles pay, I think that's okay. But I don't know. I just wonder what would get us to a you know, where we're actually not digging a hole every year.
Yeah, one of the big unknowns about the IIJA is what's going to happen after it expires. And I'm going to add some more context here because I feel it's important in understanding that some of this funding may not be around after the life of the IIJA. The IIJA is essentially the Senate version of a transportation bill that was evolving a couple of years prior to COVID. So in Congress, just like in this committee, there's always thinking about what should go into the next transportation bill. When COVID came along, it created an additional serious issue on the employment front that I think a lot of the IIJA components were built around. So the idea was the economy is not doing well. We need to make sure that unemployment doesn't get really bad. So there was the addition of additional funding beyond what the Senate bill included. This is how I think we ended up with the $225 million in bridge funding, the electric vehicle funding. I mentioned earlier that just our formula programs, about 20% of the funding comes from the general fund in Washington. And a large part of these grant programs come from the general fund also. It's not clear that these programs will necessarily be incorporated into the next 5-year bill. And I don't know, I don't have a crystal ball, but you know, consider the context of where we were economically at the time, to understand why this bill included significantly more funding than historic bills. So I'm not arguing that it won't be an issue in the future. It's just that kind of question mark out there is that, will this stuff continue past the year 5 when the IIJ ends? Or will we revert back to something that's more in tune with MAP 21, the FAST Act, you know, sort of the natural progression of transportation bills?
Other questions before we? All right, well, thank you so much, and thanks for your work in the agency. It's great to have you in our committee and to get this info. And,
thank you.
So I think we're the triumvirate here. So Chris Root from our Joint Fiscal Office is joining us this afternoon to contribute to this larger conversation around revenue. So the committee was specifically interested in getting a little bit more sense of a history of the purchase and use tax. So Chris has pulled a lot of information together for us. So please welcome back. And
thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, my name is Chris Roop. I'm a senior fiscal analyst with the Joint Fiscal Office. Like Costa, I prepared sort of something that's best conducive to looking at the document either on hard copy or on your electronic devices rather than slides. But in a very big achievement for me professionally, I was able to get my content onto one piece of paper. So I was pretty proud of that. I do want to give a shout out to my colleague in the Office of Legislative Counsel, Anthea Dexter Cooper, who did a tremendous job helping me research through session law that long predates the bound volumes sitting in the JFO library. So she was tremendously helpful with putting this together. I will also caveat all of this with stating outright that I am not the education fund analyst at JFO. I know sort of the broad brushstrokes of how the ed fund works, but if you really want to get in the weeds, you're going to want to hear from one of my colleagues rather than me. But I am going to try to keep you out of the weeds and sort of stay within the four corners of this double-sided page, just to give you all a sense of the history of the motor vehicle purchase and use tax, a very brief history. So the tax was enacted back in 1960 at a rate of 2%. And you can see that over time, that rate had been increased. I'm not going to dwell too much on the sort of pre-education fund history of the tax because it's not hugely relevant and it's kind of antiquated at this point. But when you sort of fast forward to the mid 90s, there was a law passed in 1997 called Act 60. And folks who follow education issues in this state are very familiar with the phrase Act 60. Act 60 was a law that was passed after a court decision that required Vermont to revisit how it funded public education. And as part of that process, an education fund was set up at the state level. Originally, the education fund did not have it was set up and it was funded with property taxes and sort of a grab bag of other miscellaneous revenue sources, but that had then changed in the early 2000s. But prior to 1997, the T fund received all of the money from the purchase and use tax, which at the time was 5%. The T fund also received all the money from the 15-cent gasoline tax. Part of Act 60 increased the purchase and use tax from 5% to 6%. It increased the gas tax from 15 to 19%. And then in 1998, a transfer of revenue was made into the education fund at a roughly equivalent amount to the new revenue that would be raised by those tax increases. Subsequent legislation in 1998, which is the segue to the bottom bullet point there, instead of relying on that transfer of money that was roughly equivalent to what the tax increases generated, instead dedicated tax rates were dedicated to the education fund. So that law in 1998, Act 71, stipulated that 20% of the meals and rooms tax revenue, 19% of the corporate income tax, 58.3% of the bank franchise tax revenue, as well as a portion of the gasoline revenue would be dedicated to the education fund. That law also dedicated 1/6 of the purchase and use tax to the education fund. Flip over to the, yes.
Sorry, Representative Paul.
You said that's the same as sales tax?
On motor vehicles, though. And it's not necessary, it's analogous, but it is not, it's treated a little differently than the sales tax does. There's different exceptions.
Called something different, but so is it always mirrored, been the same?
I don't know for a fact if they've both always mirrored each other.
All right.
Some states do it differently, though. Some states will tax motor vehicle sales under their sort of general sales framework. We have sort of a dedicated special tax with its own rules related to motor vehicle transactions. But flip over to the back here on page 2. A change was made in 2003 where the purchase and use tax amount dedicated to the ed fund doubled from 1/6 to 1/3, where it has been ever since, to take effect in FY 2005. And at the same time, the 16% of gas tax revenues that had previously been dedicated to the ed fund went back to the T fund. Exactly. And at the time, it was designed to be a roughly revenue neutral swap where the gas tax just stayed in the T fund. The purchase and use allocation to the ed fund doubled from what it currently was, and the dollar figures came to very close parity at the time that was made. That was really the last substantive change to the allocation of the revenue between the funds. You can see at the very bottom of page 2, I put a chart together that shows what the actual collections were by fund as far back as our Schedule 2 revenue reports went on our shared drive. And you can see that in FY 2005 is where you see the education fund share double from 1/6 to 1/3, where it has remained ever since. The current consensus revenue forecast expects that just shy of $50 million will be generated from the purchase and use tax for the ed fund. And something to keep in mind with this whole construct with the ed fund is the non-property tax revenues that go to the ed fund offset the taxes that would otherwise be paid by property owners. So the extent to which a non-property revenue source that currently goes to the ed fund is reduced and not otherwise made up for, that delta would be reflected in higher property tax rates, assuming that spending is held equal. So the ed fund works a little different than some of the other major funds do, where it's really a function of the approved spending levels made in the various school budgets. And then they take that, they factor in what we expect the non-property tax revenues will generate. And to grossly, unfairly oversimplify this, that sort of remaining amount that needs to be funded then gets worked into the property tax rates for the upcoming year.
Representative Burke has a question, yeah?
Yeah, what does the other 75% of the Meals and Rooms revenue, does that just go to the general fund?
I believe that is the case, yes. Let me confirm.
That's correct.
I have the consensus revenue forecast right in front of me.
I think it does, yeah.
You are correct. General fund.
So I appreciate, as we mess with it, if people have ideas about how to mess with this, the ultimate, the shortfall in the ed fund will fall, most likely fall on property taxes.
Probably not a good thing.
Yeah, so I mean, I appreciate the way you framed that.
You did.
They had a surplus last year, folks.
Yep.
The last couple of years. A lot of money surplus. The ed fund had a big surplus the last 2 years.
Yeah, 25 million last year.
Yeah, and to Representative McCoy's point about that, which is absolutely true, what you're seeing there is sales and use tax was doing very well during the pandemic or in the immediate aftermaths of the pandemic because there was a whole lot of federal stimulus money flowing throughout the economy, as we all know, which also showed up in other consumption taxes like the motor vehicle purchase and use tax getting stronger. And, a lot of people pivoted from spending their disposable income on experiences, which aren't always taxed, and instead bought things, which often are taxed. And the ed fund did benefit from that.
Yeah, so we're seeing that, and you can see in your diagram on the second page, the last 2 years with the motor vehicle purchase and use tax. That is kind of consistent with where the sales tax.
Yeah, and you're seeing that. That's the demand for new and used motor vehicles and the price increasing for new and used motor vehicles, which was a function both of the strong demand and the inventory constraints we saw. Some of that is likely to soften in future years.
So we got a really bad deal in 2003, transportation fund, we got a really bad deal in 2003 where they.
I don't know who was on that committee, but I
That's
And just gave, gave us back 60% of the gas tax. In the meantime, the gas tax is doing this and the purchase and use tax. Just inflation, say nothing about extra sales, it's doing this. But have that right?
I think that's right, and I would sum it up as hindsight is always 20/20, but when you look back with 20 years of hindsight to benefit from, for the reasons Costa had mentioned earlier, the taxable revenue base for the gas tax has declined over time, and that has not been the case with the purchase and use tax.
And also, never mind. I'll work it out on paper. I'm done.
You done? Okay. Other questions, comments for Chris? This is really helpful for us. You know, I mean, we've got a few things have been stacking up. You know, we heard from the state economists, we've heard from the agency, just where the revenue pressures are. We now have the FY24 budget that we'll be working on. So these are all, you know, pieces for us, you know, important context for this session and our work on the transportation budget. Okay, wow, really no questions? Okay, this is great. I think this was our last agenda item for the day. So I think we will wrap it up, and I expect you all to have memorized these reports tomorrow morning and come up with answers and solutions to our revenue pressure problem. So anyway, I say that in jest, but we'll be back tomorrow morning to continue our work on the budget with the governor's proposals in the morning. So I think we can wrap up for the day, and I hope everyone has a good evening, and we'll see you bright and early. And thank you, Chris and Anthea.